I will introduce you, and then you'll give your presentation, and then this audience will supply you with questions during our Q&A period. So, hello everyone, and welcome to Great Decisions 2022, where today we will be talking about, I have Christopher Layne, professor at the Bush School at Texas A&M University, presenting on Biden's agenda. I will announce the sponsors, and then I will introduce Chris, and then the professor will give his presentation, and then you will offer your questions. First off, thank you for being here today, and I'd like to say, first of all, that the Great Decisions Lecture Series is sponsored by the following organizations: the American Association of University Women of Tyler, the AAUW, an organization dedicated to the advancement of gender equity for women and girls through research, education, and advocacy, as well as the League of Women Voters of Tyler and Smith County, a nonpartisan voter education and advocacy organization whose mission is to educate, register, and ultimately get citizens of Smith County to the polls, educated and prepared to make informed decisions. The Tyler Public Library, and the National Foreign Policy Association, who has supplied us with this year's topics, from which the topics are chosen for discussion for groups like ours all over the U.S. The Smith County Discussion Group has been ongoing for over 30 years, and I have presented each of the last three and hosted last year and this year, and I'm proud to do so continuing. So first, our presenter today on Biden's agenda is Professor Christopher Layne. Chris Layne is University Distinguished Professor of International Affairs and the Robert M. Gates Chair in National Security at the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University, and he's presenting today remotely from College Station. His fields of interest are international relations theory, great power politics, U.S. foreign policy, and grand strategy. Professor Layne has written two books: The Peace of Illusions, American Grand Strategy from 1940 to the Present, that was published by Cornell in 2006, and along with Bradley Thayer, a work entitled American Empire, A Debate, also published in 2006 by Routledge Press. His current book project, on which I am very honored to be assisting him as a research assistant, will be entitled After the Fall: International Politics, U.S. Grand Strategy, and the End of Pax Americana. It is under contract with Yale University Press. He is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and a member of the editorial board of both International Security, a distinguished academic journal, and another one, Security Studies. And also, during fall 2020, he served on a Council of Foreign Relations study group on United States-Taiwan relations. So you may want to ask him some questions about that as well. I will tell you that his views will be those that you do not, you're in for a treat today, because his views on Biden's agenda, in particular on U.S. foreign policy in general, are not those that you would hear from a standard quote-unquote expert on, say, the cable network news shows where they discuss foreign policy matters. He has very original and highly informed opinions, and with that, I will allow him to present those. So I give to you Christopher Layne. Christopher Layne, you have it.
Thank you, everybody. It's very good to be with you. I guess it's this afternoon now. It's just past 12. Even by Zoom, it is a pleasure to be able to speak with you today. You know, about 4:30 this afternoon, I will have my first class of the semester, and I am teaching American foreign policy since 1945. And I'm just going to give you a little preview of what I'm going to tell my students. And the first thing I'm going to tell them is what a very dull and uninteresting period of time we're living through if you're studying international politics or American foreign policy. As you all know, actually, it's quite the reverse. And I think there is a old Chinese curse that says, quote, "May you live in interesting times," unquote. And if that is indeed a curse or a blessing, we are living in extraordinarily interesting times. And you all know the headline issues: Russia, Ukraine, China, Iran, and the Middle East, and the forever wars, and whether they're actually over now, and big changes in the global economy. A lot of discussion about de-globalizing the international economy, which reverse a trend that has really been going on since the end of World War II. and picked up a lot of steam when the Cold War ended. And the possibility of, as a discussion would have it, quote, decoupling, unquote, the US and Chinese economies, which may prove to be easier said than done. But all of these things are straws in the wind that show you that, well, as it shows you that times are changing. And in order to really discuss the Biden foreign policy, I think we need actually a little bit of historical context. So let me lapse into being a professor rather than a foreign policy analyst for a moment. There are really two broad schools of thought about American foreign policy. One is realism, which is state-centric. It's based on the idea that the international system is anarchic, and by anarchic, we don't mean that it's rampant chaos. We simply mean there's no central authority in the international system to make and enforce rules. So basically, every state is on its own. It's a self-help system, which means there is a great focus, especially for great powers, on pursuing security, however that is defined, and accumulating power, however that is defined. So it's a competitive realm, if you're a realist. On the other hand, there is the liberal internationalist approach, which we often associate with Woodrow Wilson, who I suppose, at least in this country, was the father of liberal internationalism. And liberal internationalism is sort of based on a different view of the world, a more hopeful view that sees the bases for cooperation rather than competition and conflict. So what are the three things that the three sort of pillars of liberal internationalism? One is democracy, and the idea that democratic states don't fight other democracies, so that there is an incentive to sort of divide the world into good, i.e. democratic states, and bad, i.e. non-democratic states. And the idea, which has been very deeply held in American foreign policy, at least since World War I, that bad states are troublemakers, and the way to make the international system more peaceful, there is sort of an irony here, is to get rid of those bad actors, which often means going to war. Economic interdependence, that's another important pillar. The idea that states that trade form these linkages that draw them together, and these linkages become so important to their common prosperity that they won't risk war, which could destroy these connections that cause prosperity. And there's a very famous book written, I think it was the first edition, was published in 1911, if I'm not mistaken, by Norman Angell, who was a British politician and thinker and activist. It's called The Great Illusion. And Angell, and remember now, this is 1911, said that the states, the great powers of Europe, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Austria-Hungary, had become so interdependent, so connected, so interwoven economically, that war was virtually unthinkable. Of course, if we count a little bit, 1911, 1912, 1913, and oh yes, 1914. So the idea is that economic interdependence leads to peace, but whether that's actually true or not is another story. And also the building of international institutions, which give a framework for cooperation. They allow states to join together without the risk of other partners stabbing them in the back, violating agreements. Institutions create a set of norms about what appropriate behavior is by states. So this is a very hopeful view, liberal internationalism. And some of both, realism and liberal nationalism, has been incorporated into American foreign policy, at least since the time of Woodrow Wilson and World War I. Now, we live in an international order. And that order was created in 1945. It's often called the Pax Americana. And the foundations of that order were overwhelming American military and economic power. I think it's just worth pausing for a moment, because a lot of what the Trump and Biden administrations are dealing with is the possibility that maybe this Pax Americana is sort of fraying at the edges and may not last. It's being challenged. So what were the bases of the Pax Americana that was created in 1945? As I said, overwhelming American military power. The United States in 1945 was the only great power with nuclear weapons. It was the only great power with the ability to project power far from its own homeland. The US had by far the world's most powerful armed Air Force and most powerful Navy. And it ended World War II with bases all around Eurasia, from Europe to East Asia. Economically, I think American power was even more impressive in 1945 than our overpowering military strength. Economically, in 1945, the US produced half of everything that was made in the world. Now, you all know that part of that reflects the fact that the other belligerents in the war, Germany and Japan, were destroyed. Russia was destroyed economically, because most of the war on the Eastern Front was fought on Russian territory. And of course, even the British, the cost of maintaining their war effort sapped their long-term economic growth, which has already been sapped by World War I. So every other state, ally or enemy, was weakened by the war. America was strengthened, so our relative power compared to other states was extraordinary. The US possessed 2/3 of the world's gold reserves and current foreign exchange reserves. So the US was extraordinarily powerful, and US policymakers, even during the war, while the war was being fought, had a set of war aims and vision for what they saw as the post-World War II order. And you know what that is, the security and institutional frameworks for that order, whether it's NATO, the United Nations, the World Trade Organization. In those days, it was called the GATT, but it became the WTO in the 1990s. All of these institutions, including the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, all of them were created by the United States in conjunction with others, but the United States taking the lead. And this system, this post-war international order, which many of us who are realists call the Pax Americana, rested on those hard power and soft power foundations. Soft power meaning the attractiveness of our economic system and our political system and our culture to others in the post-World War II era. But, you know, I am a realist in IR theory terms. So I'm not going to say we did all of this out of the goodness of our hearts. It's like my mother, my late mother, used to tell me, she said, don't do good, do well. Well, the United States, by creating this international order, was doing well for itself. And the fact is that benefited many other states in the international system, which made them willing to defer to American leadership. Now, others would describe the post-World War II order, not necessarily as the Pax Americana, but as the liberal rules-based international order, which is not a very mellifluous term, so I use an acronym for that, the LRBO, Liberal Rules-Based International Order. And if you read what liberal internationalists are writing about American foreign policy these days, they are focused on preserving the LRBO. Now, I don't think you should make a distinction between the LRBO and the Pax Americana, because they're one and the same. And it is precisely the future of the Pax Americana that is in doubt today. The basis of the international order that was constructed in 1945. Now, I got up early today and read the New York Times, and there's a very interesting quote in a story about the US, Russia, and Ukraine today. There's a quote from Senator Murphy of Connecticut, and he says, quote, "Russia's actions in eastern Ukraine and Crimea and the actions that they are planning today represent the most serious assault on the post-World War II order on our lifetime," unquote. Now, we can discuss whether that is in fact true, but I will say to you, you can find a lot of quotes like that from American politicians, elected office holders, and members of the foreign policy establishment, and not just about Russia challenging the post-World War II order, but especially China challenging the post-World War II order. So before we talk about the specifics of those challenges post-World War II order, let's talk about what we mean about an international order, how it comes into being. After every major great power war since the modern international system began, which is generally dated 1500, these wars have ended with peace treaties. They've ended, in some cases, with institutions created after World War I and World War II. But every war ends with a peace settlement. And that peace settlement is usually designed by the victors, and usually it's designed mostly by a single hegemonic power that has the military and economic capabilities and the political ambition to create an international order. Those international orders rest on fundamentally the balance of power, both economic and military power, that exists at the time these international orders are created. And when change happens, as it always does, because the balance of power, distribution of power in the international system is never static, it's always dynamic. As Paul Kennedy said in his famous 1987 book, there are always some great powers that are rising and others that are declining. And that process, that cycle of rise and decline among great powers, affects international orders. And E.H. Carr wrote a classic book on this called The 20 Years Crisis, and he was writing about why in the 1930s, the settlement that ended World War I, the so-called Versailles Treaty settlement, was being challenged. It was being challenged because Germany was resurgent economically and militarily, and it had a lot of grievances against the Versailles Treaty system. And Carr said, you know, you've got two kinds of powers in the international system. You have status quo powers that are happy with the way things are, and they want to preserve that international order that will keep the status quo intact. And then there are other states that are, quote, revisionist because they are disadvantaged by the existing international order and they want to see it change. So if the international order is really being challenged today, it's not so hard to see why. All right, first I'm going to issue a word here. You should probably close your ears because I'm going to use the word decline and use it with respect to American power. Now, American power reached its apogee after World War II, sort of stayed on a steady plane. You could say America's relative power even increased after the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union imploded. But the fact is, America's share of world power, which is usually measured by GDP, gross domestic product, is declining. Now, I don't know how many of you know who John Huntsman is. He was a Republican governor of Utah who actually resigned his position as governor to serve as U.S. ambassador to China during the Obama administration. And then he came back to run unsuccessfully for the Republican presidential nomination in 2012. But it's good that he came back because he uttered one line, which I think basically says a lot about the way the American foreign policy establishment thinks about the US role in the world. And folks, you can't make this up. This is what John Huntsman said, quote, "Decline is un-American," unquote. My response to that, it might be un-American, but that doesn't mean it's not happening. And we can see that if you're talking about relative power, the US advantage over other states, well, that's really beginning to shrink with respect to China. I mean, I'm very surprised more people don't talk about this. You always see newspaper stories that, well, China's on track to overtake the US as the world's largest economy. In 2014, the International Monetary Fund said, measured by purchasing power parity, which is one of two alternative metrics that can be used to measure GDP, China already had passed the US as the world's largest economy. The other metric is market exchange rate, which is, the comparative value of their currencies, and you measure the size of their economies that way. In terms of market exchange rate, the US is still somewhat ahead of China, but even that is going to change probably by the end of this decade, although with the effect that the pandemic is having on everyone in the international economy, we'll see. But the fact is, we're not talking about the rise of China anymore. We're talking about China has risen. It is a great power, and fundamentally a great power equal to the United States. And you can think, your light bulbs should all be going on. They're rising power. They didn't create the Pax Americana. As they close the power gap with the US, they're probably going to want to change a lot in the international system to suit their needs, their ambitions, their interests. And of course, we also have the resurgence of Russia. And the Russians basically are also a revisionist state. And they look at the security order that was established in Europe after the end of the Cold War, and they are not happy. And we'll talk about that. Now, let's move on to Biden. But before we can talk about Biden, we need to talk about Trump, because there's actually a lot of continuity between the Trump and Biden foreign policies. Now, what do we know about Trump? Trump wanted to walk away from the nuclear agreement with Iran, with that wonderful acronym, JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. We also know that Trump made a lot of statements that basically said he was unhappy with the liberal rules-based international order. He wasn't a big fan of economic interdependence and free trade. And he wasn't a big fan of America's alliances, particularly our alliance with Europe through NATO. And the Trump National Security Strategy, which was published in 2017, declared the return of great power war. By the way, we all think that the primary architect of that document was then Defense Secretary Mattis. And Trump also, at least I won't say Trump personally, but under his watch, we saw a dramatic shift in the US attitudes, foreign policy establishment attitudes towards China. Before, let's say, 2017, US policy was still pretty much a policy of engagement on the assumption that, the two economies were closely linked, and trade and investment in China were good for the United States. And then suddenly, and how suddenly? Edward Luce, who is a columnist for the Financial Times and is one of the most perceptive observers of American politics around, wrote a column in the fall of 2017 where he said that he had never seen such a dramatic shift in American foreign policy in such a short time as American policy changed under Trump's administration with respect to China. And suddenly, instead of engagement, there's all this talk that began during the Trump administration of a new Cold War with China. Now, I think it's fair to say that under Trump, a lot of people in the American foreign policy establishment essentially manifested what you might call buyer's remorse by admitting China to the World Trade Organization in 2001. I think most people in the American foreign policy establishment, very naively in my opinion, but they thought, this is what they thought, let China into the World Trade Organization, they'll become integrated into the global economy, they'll become integrated into the liberal rules-based international order, they'll become more liberalized and move towards democracy in their political system. They will accept American norms of behavior economically, and they will cooperate with the United States. A lot of people look back on that bargain, and I think they're disappointed. China obviously is not democratized. It's foolish to expect that they would, but a lot of people in the American foreign policy establishment really thought that bringing China into the liberal rules-based international order would bring about these positive results. Obviously, did not happen. All right, so Trump left office, and President Biden became president, and moved into the White House. And he announced, even during his campaign, that, quote, America would be back, or as once he became president, America is back. And what did he mean by that? He meant that America was going to reinvigorate its alliances. It was going to resume the mantle of global leadership, which Biden and his advisors believed that Trump had sort of abandoned. But how much change was there really with the fundamentals of the Trump foreign policy? And I would say very little. First of all, President Trump wanted to get the US out of the forever wars in the Middle East, in Iraq, and Afghanistan. And that happened under President Biden's administration. And I think that was the right thing to do, although he's received a lot of criticism for it. On the other hand, one point of departure in these two administrations was the nuclear deal with Iran. So Trump renounced it. Biden is trying to restore it. Negotiations are underway as we speak in Vienna. And from the newspaper reports, there seemed to be a lot of reason to hope that there will be a renewed nuclear accord that will limit Iran's ability to produce nuclear weapons. And that is a plus. And it's also a difference between the two administrations. Now, I guess the big difference between the Biden administration and the Trump administrations, Biden administration is actively trying to restore US relations with NATO, and is trying to create an alliance, or de facto alliance, called the Quad, with Australia, India, and Japan as the other three partners, to contain China. And now we sort of have to think about what that means, where we're headed with that. And the Biden administration also is continuing the Trump policy toward the Biden administration is continuing President Trump's China policy. Hardline stance against China, denouncing China for alleged genocide in Xinjiang against the Uyghur Muslim minority, or actually it may not be a minority. Balanced population is very closely split there. Keeping the trade and tech wars against China that President Biden initiated in place. So this hardline, very hawkish policy towards China that President Biden started has not shifted. under President Biden. So let's take a look at what all this means. So first, there is a challenge. There is a challenge to the Pax Americana or the Lurbio, whatever you wish to call it. And that is, again, not to be too repetitive, it's a reflection of the changing power balance in the world. And we should expect that a risen China that has emerged pretty much as a great power equal with the United States and a resurgent Russia would be unhappy with an international order that reflects a time when the US power, relatively compared to theirs, was much greater than it is now, when, at least with respect to US and China, so China is almost equal with us. So these two great powers want a much greater voice in shaping the international order. They want their grievances resolved. And we can see that there is, a dangerous road ahead. For example, one of Paul Kennedy is one of the few scholars who's written 2 books that are classics. People produce lots of books, but few of them are truly classics. One was The Rise and Fall of Great Powers. Okay, a lot of people know about that book. But a book that a lot of people may not know about, unless they're historians, is this book on the rise of the Anglo-German antagonism from 1860 to 1914. And when you look at that book and how he describes the drivers of the rising animosity between 2 states that historically had had good relations, Prussia/Germany on one hand, Great Britain on the other. It's very, very sobering. So why did the British not like rising power of Wilhelmine Germany? First, because Wilhelmine Germany challenged Britain's economic ascendance. Secondly, because rising Wilhelmine Germany tried to build a navy to challenge Great Britain's control of the oceans. And third, because a rising and dominant Wilhelmine Germany was in a position to establish itself as the hegemon, the dominant power on the European continent. And we all know historically the overriding principle of British foreign policy from the time they became a great power, from the Elizabethan times, was don't let another power, a single power, dominate the European continent. Don't let that dominant power control the level countries. Don't let them have enough power to challenge Great Britain's security. But it wasn't just geopolitical factors. It wasn't just the balance of power that caused the British to fear the rise of Germany before World War I. It's a huge ideological difference between Britain and Germany. Britain was liberal. They believed in democracy. They believed in rule of law. They believed in free trade. And when they looked at Germany, they didn't see a nation rightly or wrongly. I'm not sure their perceptions were entirely correct, but nevertheless, they were the British perceptions. Germany was a bunch of jackbooted militarists who wanted to run amok in the world and rampage, and Britain would be harmed by that. And so as we got closer and closer to 1914, the sense of Germany as not just a naval rival, not just a great power rival, but as an ideological rival, really shaped British policy. And you don't need me to sit here and tell you, when President Biden gets up and says, we're going to organize a coalition of democracies, and we're going to use that coalition of democracies to contain China and Russia. Well, when you divide the world into good states and bad states, the consequences often are not good. It creates enhanced hostility, enhanced risk of war. Because we all know that if you identified a state as a bad state you can't accommodate them with diplomacy, because that is actually appeasement, which is one of the worst words in the, I guess, the American foreign policy lexicon. Nobody wants to be guilty of appeasement. And so once you put this label on states that they're bad states, you limit the ability of diplomacy to ameliorate competing interests, and you really put yourself on the path to conflict. I would say the U.S. is definitely on the path to conflict with China. I will tell you, when Jeff was giving his introduction, he mentioned that I was on the Council on Foreign Relations Study Group. I'm going to say something funny here. I hope you get the humor. I think it costs $450 a year if you're a member of the Council of Foreign Relations to be a member. And for that $450, you get 6 issues of foreign affairs for free, right? Yeah, $450 membership, you get 6 issues for free. I think I've been a member somewhere around 35 years. I would never been asked to be on the study group until last year. I was on the study group on U.S.-Taiwan relations, and now I'm on the study group on the pivot to Asia and U.S. grand strategy. And I'll tell you, sitting in on these meetings and listening to people speak during the question and answer period, I'm afraid to talk. I'm afraid that if I suggested that maybe we need a more accommodative policy towards China, maybe we need to think about whether we really want to defend Taiwan, that I'd be laughed out of the room. So I don't say anything. But if you sat in on these meetings and you heard sort of the hawkish sentiments that these people who are card-carrying members of the American foreign policy establishment have toward China, you might really wonder too where this relationship is headed, and whether war is in the offing, not necessarily tomorrow, at least not in East Asia. But war could also come in Europe. So we're all focused right now on Ukraine. And I think we need to think very seriously about where we're headed with Russia. And first of all, we should remind ourselves, the U.S. has no treaty obligation to defend Ukraine. We should probably go back and read some history books about Russia, not the Soviet Union, but about Russia, and remind ourselves that the connections culturally, religiously, linguistically between Russia and Ukraine have been historically extremely intimate. We should know something about Ukraine itself. The country is basically divided into, geographically, the eastern part of Ukraine has more Russian speakers. The western part of Ukraine, lots of it was historically part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and is much more nationalistic and less Russian-oriented than the eastern part of Ukraine. And we ought to think about, what are we doing there? It's like American policymakers, they all like to use this phrase. I hear it all the time. You guys have probably seen it when you read. They refer to the, quote, post-Soviet space in Europe. I guess Ukraine is part of the post-Soviet space. But what they never, the Baltic states are part of the post-Soviet space. But when they utter the term post-Soviet space, nobody ever seems to stop and take a breath and say, oh, that was also part of the pre-Soviet space, territories that have been part of the Russian empires for centuries. And, we can go back and look at George Kenning's very famous long telegram. And he talks about why Russia, not just the Soviet Union, was writing in 1946, because Russia has this historic sense of insecurity, because it always, because of geography, has had no great barriers to invasion. And so the Russians have always had an insecurity complex. So that was exacerbated by NATO expansion in the 1990s. It's not just that countries like what was then Czechoslovakia or Hungary were taken into NATO. It's countries like the Baltic states, which have been historically part of the Russian Empire, were taken in. It's the fact that a lot of people in the American foreign policy establishment are unwilling to rule out taking Ukraine into NATO. So I think we need to really reflect on where we're headed. All right, so I'm going to wrap this up. They're basically, for those of us who study American foreign policy, there's sort of two groups now that exist. One is I call the foreign policy establishment. They want to preserve the Pax Americana, the Librio, as it is. They don't really acknowledge the decline in American power. And the other group has sort of been labeled under the term restraint. Now, restraint people were very much opposed to the, quote, forever wars, unquote, in Afghanistan and Iraq. And they said these wars are unwinnable, and I think I would consider myself as a member of that camp. I think we're right about that. I do not criticize President Biden for a moment for the way the Afghanistan adventure turned out. No one had a plausible path to victory in Afghanistan. And no one could plausibly even define what victory would mean in Afghanistan. So getting out, withdrawing was the right thing to do. It basically reduced, under both President Trump and President Biden, vastly reduced their presence in Iraq. I think that is also the correct policy. So, and this is what restraint camp got known for. But restraint was supposed to stand for something else. It was supposed to stand for opposition to unnecessary wars, to wars of choice, to reckless military adventures abroad. But curiously, when it comes to China, there is no restraint. One of the leading advocates of restraint, quote unquote, is John Mearsheim. He's a very well-known professor at the University of Chicago. He's sort of an uber hawk and uber realist. And in his book, The Great Delusion, in his conclusion, his policy recommendations, he says, quote unquote, the US must maintain overwhelming military superiority, the strongest country in the world, overwhelmingly, and not allow China to gain regional hegemony in East Asia. Well, the last time I checked, China is located in East Asia, and the United States, which has been the regional hegemon since World War II in East Asia, is located in North America. The Chinese want to dominate their own region, just like the US did at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, when we became a great power on the world stage. China wants power and prestige in the international system redistributed to reflect its rise. The United States doesn't want to give it to them, just like the British didn't want to give it to Germany before World War I. We don't seem to have any empathy whatsoever for Russia's concerns about its security and how NATO's eastward expansion threatens that, and why the idea for people in the Kremlin of Ukraine being enmeshed in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is just anathema. I mean, that's just something the Russians will never tolerate or accept. So, yeah, it's easy to say restraint and let's stay out of these forever wars that we've been fighting in the Middle East. But you know what? Those wars were a walk in the park compared to what a war with Russia would be like, or even more, a war with China. And I'll just wrap this up with one last word, and we'll get to the question and answers. You know, we hear all the time whether it's Ukraine, which isn't an ally, actually, or the Baltic states and Poland, which are, or Taiwan, where there's an obvious growing conflict with China. In my class, I do not let my students use the word Taiwan. I tell them whenever they want to refer to that island, they need to use the acronym RPOT, Renegade Province of Taiwan. Well, that's how the Chinese see it. So if we're going to defend these places, what does that mean? And nobody ever wants to tell you that defending our allies, quote unquote, means running the risk of nuclear conflict. Nobody ever in the foreign policy establishment tells you, if you open that door, what lies behind. And that is the possibility that lies behind. So I would argue that restraint was a great thing with respect to Afghanistan and Iraq. I think President Biden deserves credit for that. I think restraint is a great thing with Iran, and President Biden deserves credit for reopening negotiations with the Iranians on a nuclear agreement. But when it comes to the two biggest challenges, China and Taiwan, I think he deserves maybe somewhat less credit. I mean, he's jumped on the anti-China bandwagon, hardline policy militarily, forming a coalition to surround China militarily, and maintaining these trade and tech wars that President Trump inaugurated against China. Even to the extent that TikTok, of all things, was considered a national security threat to the United States. I mean, this shows you the sort of the overhyped China threat. I will say that there's some indication that President Biden himself is a little more, shall I use the term, restrained when it comes to what the U.S. should do with Russia in the crisis over Ukraine. President Biden already ruled out military force. But you know what? The people who advise him, people in the American foreign policy establishment, are a lot more hawkish on this issue than he is. And I worry that we're going to all be swept away if the Russians do use military force on Ukraine. And so both in East Asia and in Europe, you could say that the US, just like the great powers in Europe before 1914, is sort of sleepwalking to war. And with that, let's go to questions.
Okay, thank you, Professor Layne, for that very enlightening and entertaining presentation. So I'll open the floor to questions so he can hear them. I guess the microphone's on. Okay, so talk loudly if you have questions. I'll call on you, and then can you hear me?
I can hear you fine, Jeff.
You can hear them. So questions? Yes, sir.
Would it be too cold for Russia to attack Ukraine? It is January. Kind of like the Russian front in World War II. I don't think you heard.
Okay, so his question is, considering it is now late January, how would the weather affect the chances of a Russian invasion right now? Would it be too cold for that?
Well, we should all go back and read the histories of the Eastern Front during World War II. Tanks don't do well in mud. So I think a lot of people are saying that once the deep freeze hits Ukraine, I guess the end of this month in February, the ground will be frozen. It will be good weather for armored fighting vehicles. So does that mean that Putin is actually going to use military force? Well, I don't know any better than anyone else does. And every day I read the newspapers, whether it's the New York Times, the Washington Post, or the LA Times, or the Financial Times, or the Economist. Nobody knows what Putin's going to do, but everybody seems to say he's waiting for the ground. If he's going to make a military move, he's waiting for the ground to freeze. which I guess we're almost on the verge of that. So yes, weather makes a big difference in Russia. And the Germans actually found this out much to their dismay in 1941 when the weather changed and the roads turned to mud, and it was a problem. You can't fight a war with armored vehicles and tank treads going over muddy ground. So yes, the weather is very important.
Yes.
I wonder if he agrees with what the book said, that the Biden administration's exit from the Middle East more or less was so he could focus on China.
Okay, so I don't know if you heard that, but the question is, did Biden start to try to leave the Middle East or lessen America's footprint in the Middle East in order for the United States to focus on containing China?
Absolutely. I mean, that is one of the clear reasons for the pivot to Asia. I mean, if you're pivoting, you're not only pivoting to something, you're pivoting away from something. And this is something that's come up on both those Council on Foreign Relations study groups that I'm on, is the fact that the US, to use Paul Kennedy's famous term, is sort of imperially overstretched. So, we have to take care of East Asia. We have to take care of Europe. We have to take care of the Middle East. And we don't have the resources to do all that. In fact, these are meetings are under what are called Chatham House rules, which means, you can talk about what was discussed, but you can't attribute anything to a specific person. So I won't, but I will say that some members of these study groups have made it very clear that the US needs to redeploy because it doesn't have the resources to stay in the Middle East at the same time that we confront China. And people, at least a couple of them, were talking about, if the US is serious about confronting China and Russia, we need to increase our defense budget by 3 to 5% every year, basically out into infinity. So you ought to think about not only what these commitments that we're making in East Asia and Europe might mean in terms of becoming involved in a nuclear war, but also what they mean financially if we're serious about pursuing them, and what it means for our economy. But yes, the pivot is definitely meant to reorient the way not just forces are deployed, clearly that's important, but to reorient the way people in Washington give their time and attention to various issues. And right now, China and Russia are at the top, and the Middle East has been pushed down.
I saw a question over here before. Yes, sir.
You're going to mention, why haven't you mentioned about the millions of Ukrainians that were killed by the Russians before World War II?
Did you hear that?
No, I did not.
Okay, good. Okay, so the question is, you talked about the close historical relations between the Ukrainian people and the Russian people. What about Ukrainian memories of, I believe it's the Holodomor, the Ukrainian famines during Stalin's crash industrialization and land reform in the 1930s and stuff? Because the Ukrainians, at least in terms of their current national conception, to certain Ukrainians, there is very much the sense of grievous toward Russia. So
the millions that were killed.
Yeah, about the millions of Ukrainians who died during the 1930s and the lead up to World War II.
Oh, absolutely. That's one of the things that makes Central and East Central Europe always such a potential powder keg, is a lot of the animosities have not gone away. But, the Ukrainian nationalists tend to be in the western part of Ukraine. I don't think, Putin, even if he is, as I said, I don't know any more than any of you what Putin is really thinking. But I would suspect that if he were actually to send Russian troops into Ukraine, his goal would not be to go beyond the Dnieper River. He just basically want to lop off the Russian-speaking Eastern Ukraine and would leave Western Ukraine alone. You know, all these places have historical memories, and clearly people in Ukraine have every reason to remember what happened as a result of Stalin's forced collectivization of agriculture during the late 20s and 30s. But you know, you just never know where the cycle begins. You know, look at the Baltic states. They had 20 years of independence between the two world wars. Before that, they were part of the Russian Empire. During World War II, they will tell you that the reason that many of them collaborated with Germans was because of a nationalistic response against Soviet oppression. But you know, it's the same thing with people in the West Ukraine. During World War II, there were two sides, right? There was the Allied side, which included the Soviet Union. There was the other side that included Hitler. I think that the side that was fighting Hitler was the right side to be on. But yes, I mean, these historical memories are deep. And, you know, at the end of the day, if we had creative diplomacy, you know, we would be looking for a way to assuage Russia's concerns about its security. And there's ways to do that without handing over Ukraine to being ruled again by Moscow. You know, during the Cold War, Finland was allowed to be independent in terms of its domestic policy, but it was required to be non-aligned in terms of its foreign and security policy. So the Russians did not feel threatened by Finland. Historically, there are lots of instances of great powers agreeing to spheres of influence, agreeing to have certain countries as neutral or buffer zones. For some reason, that's not very attractive to the American foreign policy establishment. I mean, you can find on Google any number of comments by American policymakers about how we don't believe in spheres of influence. But historically, that's how great power politics was practiced, and agreeing to these kinds of sort of divisions of who has the most influence where is a tried and true way of ameliorating great power conflict. So, you know, the trick here is not to hand Ukraine back to the Kremlin, but to find a way to solve Russia's legitimate concerns about its security without doing that.
One more question. Yes, sir. Yes. I'm not sure if the mic's on. Yeah, but he can hear you from here.
I think most Americans are scared to death of trusting Iran to have a new nuclear treaty, from the standpoint that they didn't honor the first one because they kicked out the inspectors or wouldn't allow them to go see where they wanted to go. Plus, they were going to have a bomb by nuclear power by 2025 anyway. And I'm certainly sure that people in the United States don't trust Kerry to be carrying these kind of conversations on. So that seems to be the Biden's trap here to see what they're going to come up with. I think the American people are quite apprehensive of what's going to come down the pipe.
Professor Layne, were you able to hear that?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
I always wonder why American policymakers are so obsessed with Iran getting a nuclear weapon. I mean, if you understand the theory of nuclear deterrence, you know that they're not going to use it, certainly not going to use it against us. Their nuclear arsenal, even if they had one, could never reach anywhere near parity with the United States. And you know what? States, it's easy, as American policymakers indeed have done, to label certain states as crazy states. I mean, you probably heard the rogue states. Somehow, if they get nuclear weapons, they'll behave irresponsibly. They'll use them in a dangerous way. They'll act in a dangerous way. But you know, there's really no tried and true reason to believe that. My mentor, when I was in graduate school, Kenneth Waltz, is one of the most famous professors, thinkers about international politics of the second half of the 20th century. And he wrote about the spread of nuclear weapons. When states get nuclear weapons, they become careful because they understand the risks of nuclear weapons. Great example is China. Before China had nuclear weapons, Mao Zedong used to spout off all the time, oh, nuclear war won't be bad for us. No matter, even if we lose 3/4 of our people, we'll still be a lot bigger in terms of population than North America and Europe would be after a nuclear war. So we don't care about it. But once China was actually a nuclear power, they stopped talking like that because they realized nuclear weapons, you know, what are they good for? They're good for deterring an attack on one's own homeland, period. So, you know, I think we should sort of look back on why is it that Iran prospectively acquiring nuclear weapons is such a problem? I mean, well, I guess we can say we still remember the hostage crisis, but that was 40 years ago. Is that going to be the determinant of American policy forever when it comes to Iran? Or is it sort of a strange combination of American domestic politics and foreign policy? And basically, we're carrying the water for another state.
May I come back at that a little bit? Iran is the leading nation for terrorism around the world. And you don't think that they might be giving that to terrorists? You may have a suitcase come in here with an atomic bomb, not a bomb, but you can have something go off like that, could wipe out New York City.
Well, look, you know, we could sit here and debate this all afternoon. I just don't agree that you know, nuclear weapons and the technology that goes into them can be traced back. I think there are a lot of reasons why the Iranians would not give nuclear weapons, let's say, to what, Hezbollah or Al Qaeda. No, they would not, in all likelihood. I mean, it's easy to come up with all these fantasies like Tom Clancy, right? And that, what movie was it where Baltimore gets blown up? But these are not really realistic scenarios. But the American foreign policy establishment loves threat inflation. So we ought to be thinking, you know, Iran is actually a state that we should actually be trying to cooperate with in that region. But I think that's, you know, very difficult to make that argument in political climate here in the States.
Okay, so we've gone over the hour, but it's because everyone's having so much fun and enjoying our conversation with Professor Layne. So I would like all of you to get a hand for
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Okay, yes, and join us again next Wednesday, the 26th, when our local professor of history at UT Tyler, Colin Snyder, will be presenting on the drug war in Latin America. And I hope to see you all then. Thank you for your questions.